Welcome to the Awaken on Purpose podcast, where each week you'll receive insight, inspiration, and advice for aligning your mind, body, and spirit to achieve a fulfilled life and live your purpose with me, your host, Jennifer Spohr. You'll also hear from other leaders who share their inspirational stories and wisdom in living fulfilled, on purpose, and making an impact. If you're a mission-driven leader and you're passionate about learning and integrating all the things that empower you to live and lead a fulfilled, purpose-led life, this is the show for you. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome as a guest to the show today, Stephanie Raffelock. She is the author of Creatrix Rising: Unlocking the Power of Midlife Women. She's a former iHeartRadio host and now a popular guest on podcasts where she inspires women to embrace the strength and passion of their personal story. Hey, Stephanie, welcome.
Hey, good to see you.
Yeah, it's great to see you too. And I'm so glad that we're having the opportunity to connect. I love encouraging others to share their personal stories similar to you. So I'm really excited to have this conversation today. And just to kind of kick things off, I'd love for you to just share with us more about, what inspired you actually to do this work?
Well, I was inspired several years ago to write about aging because women hold the aging process differently than men do, to a certain degree. And what I discovered was that women my age, none of them were going gently into that good night. I got all kinds of feedback off of blogs and articles and interviews that said, I want to be vital. Why should I stop? Why should I stop now at 65? So that's where the work initially began. It was looking at the process of growing older and what we can do to reinforce the fact that it is a remarkable and noble passage and not something to be feared or held with disdain. That was the initial work. What came on the heels of that and this second book was there were three events that happened in our world rather quickly that really contributed to feminist history. The first one was the Women's March of 2017 and the kind of unification that was brought together that day. I mean, it wasn't just women marching like in my generation. It was women with men, with husbands, with grandfathers, with brothers, with children, with grandmothers. I mean, it was huge, even though it was called the Women's March. It was very inclusive. At the time, I was living in a little town in Ashland, Oregon that only had 20,000 people in it. And the newspaper article about the Women's March said that they were expecting 600 people. Well, 10,000 people later, I watched from a hill as Lithia Park filled up with half of my town, and it was amazing. So that was the first thing that happened, this great sense of unification. The second thing that happened was that in the following year, in 2018, more women over the age of 50 ran for local, state, and political office than ever before in our country's history. And finally, the third thing that happened on the heels of those two things was the hashtag #MeToo movement. And for the first time, hundreds and thousands of women didn't feel like they had to hold on to that dirty little secret anymore. There was a liberation, and all you had to say was, hashtag #MeToo. And so those three things set into motion from my mind, this idea that there was a collective shift in consciousness happening for women. And that's where the work for Creatrix Rising came from, unlocking the power of midlife women. So I'm still kind of on the aging bend, but it's grown since my first book.
Yeah, I mean, I personally believe, I've grown to believe, I guess, really, I should say that aging is like a fine wine. I enjoy getting older because I'm really passionate about learning, and I just think it's fun.
I think that you've hit one of the big clues. People ask me sometimes, what are the steps to aging well? And, you just hit it. It's like, I love to learn, which means you're a curious person, and curiosity can take you a long way. Curiosity, gratitude, attitude. a guy named, I hope I get his name right, George M. Valiant was the director of the Harvard study on aging, which is one of the longest going studies in the country. I think it's been going on for 40 years. So he's one of many directors. But he wrote in his book, Aging Well, he said, at the end of the day, it's less about your attitude or less about your cholesterol numbers and more about your attitude. And I really believe that about aging. It's more about your attitude and less about, your achy joints or your cholesterol numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to ask you this question because I'm sure you just have so much wisdom to share around it. And is that, prior to starting my own coaching practice, I spent a lot of years in the corporate environment. And for women, in this traditional patriarchal society that we've been, brought up in, a lot of women feel pressure to be masculine.
Yeah. I think that, we haven't been in the corporate world for that long when you think about it. Yeah. I mean, it was really like World War II was a marking point for women to enter the workforce, not necessarily corporate America, but the workforce because the men were overseas. But when the men came back, it was like, no, I'm going to do this now. But suddenly this sense of independence had kind of crept into women's consciousness. And it was like, well, but what if I want to work? What if I don't want to stay home and raise kids? What if there's another way to do this? So in the 1970s, when women began to really enter the workforce in droves, there was no instruction manual. We just kind of entered the workforce. And I think that the common denominator and in thought was, in order to work in corporate America, I must be like a man. And I don't know if you remember the fashion from the 1970s, but there were a lot of pinstripe suits with really big shoulder pads. We all looked like misshapen linebackers, I think. And that's what we did. And now I think that this generation coming up behind us is learning that you don't have to be like anyone but yourself. And in fact, what we've learned is that women need to learn to be more like women in a workplace. We hold the word power differently than the men hold the word power. Men have power over something or over someone. Right. There's that kind of warrior archetype mentality. And women have a different kind of power that is quieter, that comes from self-confidence, but is nonetheless as strong as pushing your way through something. Women work cooperatively, whereas men will work independently, to be the star. So it's still an interesting time. And I think it's a time when we're still in flux in that particular arena, especially in corporate America.
It is. I mean, all of us, right? Whatever gender or however each person chooses to identify themselves, there is a masculine and a feminine energy, right? And
right.
I believe that ideally you want to achieve a balance within that, on the more heavily on the masculine side of things. There's a tendency to do and take action, which is a lot of how many of us have been conditioned to live, in society up to this point. And the feminine is really more about, as you were saying, maybe, I don't know, like if quiet is the right word, but just as powerful, but coming from a different space. I believe ideally you want to, find a balance within that, because I think there's a time for doing, but there's also a time for being.
Yes. Well said.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Similar to you, I believe that everyone is here, for a purpose, and that everyone's personal story is important because it's our own experience that I believe is crystallized into wisdom, and then we can actually share that wisdom in service to others.
Yes. Well, these are interesting times for all of that. And
Yes. Yes.
but especially the piece about women telling their story, because we do come from a patriarchal society. And so women have not had the same opportunity to share their stories. Thus, we've not had the same opportunity to learn from each other as men have. And in my book, Creatrix Rising, the word creatrix means a woman who makes things. And I liked that word because as women get older, we begin to see ourselves as less significant, maybe not as relevant. And, the old archetype is the archetype of crone. And crone is a word that entered the lexicon in the 1300s, and it's meant as an insult. It means disagreeable old woman. Now, I don't know any woman who wants that term, really,
Yeah.
but the idea of creatrix, a woman who makes things, someone who makes things, makes a lot more sense to me, that we begin to see ourselves differently, and therefore we begin to label ourselves differently. I know in a perfect world, there would be no labels, but we do label everything. So why not choose the words that better reflect who we are and who we're becoming at this time of collective change in our world?
Absolutely. I want to just, talk a little bit more about something you mentioned, and that is that, the belief that many women, as they continue to age, believe that they become less relevant. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's supported by a couple of things. It's supported by, several thousand years of archetypal conditioning.
Yeah.
It's also supported by a very robust advertising industry.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at advertising, what you see reflected back to you are attractive faces of younger people in most instances. But you rarely see, the 75-year-old grandmother that's still going to Pilates. You
Mm-hmm.
rarely see, I have a girlfriend that's a big hiker. She wrote a book about hiking a few years ago, and she hikes the Pacific Crest Trail every year. She's 73, 74 years old now. She throws a pack on her back, 40 pounds, and she keeps up with everybody. And it's like, I want to see that image coming back at me. But we don't see those images. And of course, what we look for, I think, as human beings is we look to be seen. We want to know that we matter, and we want to be heard. So if you're not seeing that in the culture, it's kind of easy to slip into a feeling of insignificance or irrelevance. And I hate to say it, but that is a call that's coming from inside the house. I mean, it would really be nice to have outside validation, but I don't think it's coming anytime soon. Maybe in the next generation, we will see more of that, where people of all ages are valued. It's, these kids today, and they're not really kids, but, a couple generations down from mine, they have this great sense of inclusion that
Mm-hmm.
my generation didn't have. And I think that it is subtly but consistently making the biggest difference in our world. This sense of inclusiveness, and that at some point is going to start including age. But for now, we have to do it for ourselves. We have to stand up and let our voices be heard and be counted.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, and you answered the question before I had a chance to ask, and is that, did you believe that we're able to shift that conditioning within the collective? So you're saying it's a next generation shift.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is shifting now because of the way this younger generation is. I was talking to a mom the other day. She's 50 now, and so her kids are, they're almost leaving the house, or they have left the house. And she said to me, sometimes I worry about my kids, they don't seem as resilient as my generation. But she said, on the other hand, they're so inclusive. And
Mm-hmm.
we need that in our world so much right now.
Yeah.
It's like sometimes I wake up in the morning and I make the mistake of turning on the news and I go, how did we get so divided? And so I think this younger generation does bring something that
Yeah.
is slowly but consistently changing things.
I believe we're very divided right now too, but I also believe that what we see on the news and hear on the radio is like it's cherry picked, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. It's like, we're going to give you the most sensational story, the worst
Yeah,
case scenario, because that's what gains viewers. We'll hook you with that.
exactly.
And I
Yeah.
agree. And it's a tough balance, to want to be aware of what's going on in the world, but at the same time, be aware of the joys and gratitudes in your own life.
Yes.
It's a dance daily, and you got to work it.
It really is, and it's important, especially just with our current world climate too, I believe, to know what truth feels like for us in
Right.
our body,
Right.
to listen to that.
And I think we're out of touch, with our
Yeah.
bodies a lot. We just, you and I are talking over a screen, and we're so implanted on our devices so much of the time that sense of feeling what truth feels like in your body is, it's hard to come by, I think, these days.
Yes, absolutely. I agree. Although technology can be a blessing too, right? Because
Yeah.
here you and I are having this great conversation, and we're going to be able to share it with so many people that
Yeah.
will be able to benefit from it. Absolutely. You, at the beginning of our conversation, you had mentioned, the Women's March, the Me Too movement. Those are a couple of many events, significant events that have taken place over these last few years that um, I feel like have served as a wake up call for us to an extent. And then, then came COVID and all of the things that are still happening, as a result of that. What would be your number one piece of advice for other women to not just, navigate successfully through this time, but to be able to lead forward through this time?
Boy, that is such a big question. And of course, on the spot, I don't have time
It's
to
okay. It's real life. I asked the big
amount of thought.
question, so
But it's the big questions that are the most important. I think that this is a time to be reflective with ourselves. It's like, for a while there, I was feeling impervious. I had a vaccination and things were opening up, and I went to the grocery store for the first time without a mask. And now things feel like it's closing down again. And there's a real sense of anxiousness in our culture, a real sense of kind of frustration of, why isn't this moving along forward? So, like probably a lot of people, and also a function of age, because I sit at the brink of 70, is that I'm spending more time alone than I would like to. I'm fortunate to have a husband that I like to hang out with, and a dog that gets me outside every day. But once again, I'm navigating the world through this kind of smaller, it's a smaller world. I'm just not out as much. So what can I do? I can be reflective. And that means that I get to take time every morning to sit on my back porch with my cup of tea and just kind of feel into the world, feel into the day. I'm fortunate to have a dog because my dog demands a walk every day. So I don't get a day where I don't feel like it. It's like, no, I got to get out, walk the dog a few miles. So I think that this is a time, if we're going to lead, that we have to then keep up our inner strength, our inner confidence. And how do you do that? You do that by reaching out, even if it's over Zoom. You do that by getting out into your neighborhood. I still feel perfectly safe walking through my neighborhood with my dog and having conversations with my neighbors, because we can be certainly an appropriate distance apart. So I have human contact. There's still a way to have human contact in all of this. And once again, I just think it's a time to reflect. Who do we want to be? How can this make me a better person? How can it make me more sensitive to someone else's plight? How can I serve someone else during this time? There's nothing like helping someone else to make yourself feel better within yourself. So that's something that we can do during this time too. Maybe somebody that lives alone that isn't going to get out much because we're kind of, contracting again a little bit. What would it take to give them a call and just be with them in a way that you can, by the phone, by the Zoom screen, whatever.
Yes, being of service to others. I love that. Also, I think having a clear sense of self, being clear on who you are and what your values are and what your beliefs are.
Well, and that speaks to the reflective part, because those are the questions you get to ask yourselves in quiet. Who am I? Who do I want to be? In a perfect world, who would I be? In an imperfect world, what's enough for me and my creator?
Absolutely. Your book would be an excellent tool, right? For personal development. So tell us a little bit more about your book.
Well, my book is a series of personal stories and essays about growing into this new archetype of the creatrix, a woman who makes things. And at the end of each chapter, I have a section called for reflection, contemplation, and journaling. And so there are questions, the big questions that you like to ask, that I like to ask, for people to grapple with. And I encourage women to find their own story. You don't have to tell all of your life all at one time, but you can find those little slivers of life. It's amazing when you sit down and you journal about a grandmother who impacted your life when you were 10 years old. For me, it was my grandmother's garden that was such a big influence on my life, because she liked to sit in her garden on her knees, you know, picking peas and pulling weeds, and she would put peas in her apron and carry them back to the house. But all throughout her garden, she had these little statues of saints and angels. She was very, very Catholic. And it was like her garden really was her sacred space. And I have loved fresh food and vegetables ever since. But I also have this sense of a reverence for nature, for the earth that grows things. And I see, when I'm out on the trail, I see little altars everywhere, a rock that's in a certain place, dried flowers that are in a certain place. And it makes me think of her. So just that one tiny little memory about my grandmother in her garden opens up this whole story of how that has affected my heart and my mind. And part of Creatrix Rising is to inspire women to discover their own stories and to share their own stories with family members, with that close, intimate girlfriend. When we witness someone else's story without trying to judge or fix, that's an amazing time too, to be the witness to somebody's story. So that's something that women give to each other. We give grace to each other.
I love that so much. I love that. And you can get your book through Amazon, right?
Yep.
And I have all of that information. So for those who are listening, we'll be sure to include the link and all of the info on that in the show notes. And is there anything in closing that you're feeling guided to bring forward?
Wow. In this time where we may spend a little more time alone, list the ways that you love yourself, so that when you wake up in the morning, you don't go to the mirror and first thing you say, I look like crap today. But you go to the mirror and you say, it's going to be a great day.
I love that. I love that so much. Choose to flip the script, because we're powerful creators, right?
That's right.
Stephanie, I've absolutely loved having you as a guest, and I really enjoyed our conversation, and I know that the listeners will too. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you for listening to the Awaken on Purpose podcast. Please visit me and subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or at awakenonpurpose.com so you never miss an episode. To learn more about how you can achieve a fulfilled life, live your purpose, and make an impact as a mission-driven leader, visit me at jenniferspore.com. And while you're there, be sure to join Awaken on Purpose, the community, to connect, collaborate, and grow in business and life with others who are like-minded.